One of the best things about playing Commander is getting to build your decks with your favorite cards from across Magic's history. Getting to use cards all the way back from Alpha to the most recent sets coming out today. It's extremely gratifying. If you're anything like me, nothing feels better than taking a look at your opening hand and seeing 30 years of Magic spread across 7 different cards. Unfortunately, not all cards from Magic's history are looked upon favorably. Quite a few of them are outright socially banned from Commander tables. This can be due to how powerful they are or how mind-numbingly painful they make games play out. Today, I want to look at some of the saltiest cards from across Magic's history and talk about how they could be redesigned for modern Commander. What's up everyone? Welcome back to the Carnarium. I'm Waste and I got another video for you today. Make sure you're plenty hydrated before going any further because things are about to get salty. So today we're going to look at some of the saltiest cards in Magic's history. I'm pulling all of these cards from EDHREC's Top 100 Saltiest Cards list. If you've never seen or heard about this list before, it's a poll that EDHREC does yearly where people can vote on the saltiest cards. Each card gets a salt score, and they formulate a Top 100 Saltiest Cards list. So all the cards I'm going to talk about today are either on the list currently or have been on the list but were banned and so they're no longer on the list. But as you see them, I won't really have to justify why they're salty cards. It should be pretty obvious why they're salty. But as I was reading through the list, I realized that some of these cards are salty, but they're not that far away from being playable. They just need a little bit of redesign, a little bit of a modern touch. So let's go over some cards and see if we can redesign them for modern day Magic. So the first card I want to go over is Obliterate. Obliterate is an 8-mana sorcery, 6 generic, red. It says, Obliterate can't be countered, destroy all artifacts, creatures, and lands. They can't be regenerated. So like I said, it should be obvious why this card is on the salt list. It destroys everyone's lands. Mass land destruction is extremely frowned upon in Commander, and nobody likes to play against it. And I definitely agree that mass land destruction, just for the sake of blowing up all the lands, is not healthy for the format. A lot of the times when people run mass land destruction, they don't really have a way to win the game off blowing up everyone's lands. So what ends up actually happening is they just reset the game, and there's several turns where no one can do anything, and it just drags the game out for no real good reason. However, the community determining that mass land destruction is bad for the game has resulted in an equally bad thing to happen to Commander. Ramp decks are out of control, especially ramp decks that can now ramp out non-basic lands. Since players have determined that you can't blow up lands, lands are determined as safe permanent type, and therefore they can't be touched. So if you're running a strategy that involves putting lots of lands on the battlefield, there's really nothing to counteract that. And Wizards, for some reason, has decided to put out a bunch of non-basic land ramp recently. So before, you would have to ramp out basic lands, and it wasn't really that powerful. But now, you can ramp out as many non-basics as you want. Something that Red used to be really good at was hating on non-basic lands. In the early days of Magic, Red just hated on all lands, but as Magic passed through the years, it got focused down into non-basic land hate. And I think we still need non-basic land hate in modern day Magic. There has to be an answer to these decks that are ramping out all these non-basic lands. There has to be a drawback to doing it, just like everything in Magic. Otherwise the game becomes unbalanced. And right now I feel like non-basic land ramp is unbalanced. So the first thing I would change about this card is instead of saying destroy all lands, it would say destroy all non-basic lands. And then, borrowing from a card called From the Ashes, each player would then search their library for a basic land card and replace each land that was destroyed. We could have them enter untapped or tapped. It's not super important here. But let's just say we have them enter tapped. So now, this card, instead of just being mass land destruction, it's hating specifically on non-basic lands, but it allows players who put enough basics in their deck to still keep the same land count. Like I said, non-basic land ramp is out of control, and what's been happening is players have been putting the least amount of basics in their deck possible to make it function. And like I said, this is due to them feeling safe, like lands can't be touched. So why not run every single non-basic land you can stuff in your deck? There are so many game-breakingly powerful non-basic lands now. I feel like at 8 mana, this would be an appropriate response to those lands. The next thing I wanted to touch on with this card is it says destroy all creatures and all artifacts. It seems like lately Wizards has designed Red to not destroy things, but rather do lots of damage to things. For example, Blasphemous Act does 13 damage to each creature. That's effectively destroying all creatures, right? There's not going to be a lot of creatures with 14 or more toughness. So my heart really wants this card to still say destroy all creatures, but to keep this card's modern flavor, let's just put down 13 damage to each creature, so it's at least in line with Blasphemous Act. Again, remember, this card is 8 mana. And for the last clause, we'll just keep it the same, destroy all artifacts. I would keep the clause that says this can't be countered, and I would add the clause choose one or more. Turning this card into a modal spell will make it very, very popular. It's a huge wrath that can't be countered. It can deal with multiple permanent types. and in games where it's applicable, it can deal with normally untouchable lands decks. Red is probably the weakest color in the format right now, and this could be a big boost for red decks. It reintroduces some things that red was supposed to be good at before, but have long been missing from its color pie. The next card I want to talk about is Teferi's Protection. I'm sure you all know this card, but Teferi's Protection is a 3 mana instant, 2 generic, 1 white mana. Until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you have protection from everything. All permanents you control phase out. Exile Teferi's Protection. So this card has probably won more games as Commander than any other card, and it definitely has a rightful place on the Salt list because of the way it was designed. There are a handful of other cards out there that do similar effects, but Teferi's Protection is by far the best version. And the reason is because Teferi's Protection not only protects you and your board, but it does it for an entire turn cycle. So the player that casts Teferi's Protection is essentially out of the game until their next turn, which means there's an entire 3 turns of spells being cast, combats going on, where they're just not a part of it. Players have become smart and started to cast Teferi's Protection in their own main phase just to protect their own board state. They're basically like, well, I've got a game-winning board state, and as long as I survive till my next turn, I'm going to win, so I'm just going to nope out of this situation. And then there's nothing the table can do. Your only hope is to have a counterspell to get Teferi's Protection on the stack, but other than that, the table's screwed. So unlike other situations where a player pulls ahead, the other 3 players at the table can usually unify and say, hey, we got to take this player out or we're all going to lose. And Teferi's Protection takes that really fun and unique part of Commander completely out of the game. So this is sort of an easy one, but the way to fix Teferi's Protection is keep it exactly the same, except say until end of turn instead of until the end of your next turn. That way this card kind of works the way it was designed, where it works as a big mega fog, but not as a shroud of invulnerability for an entire turn cycle. So I hope Wizards learn their lesson on this card and they don't print anything like it in the future, but I do hope they continue to print cards like this that give protection for 1 turn. I think fogs and fog-like cards are super important to the game, especially if they have downsides to them or huge costs that you have to pay, but we can't allow players to be uninteractable for an entire turn cycle. That kind of design is bad for the game. Alright, the next card I want to talk about is Hullbreacher. So Hullbreacher's actually been banned out of Commander, but I still want to go over it because I think it has something to offer the format. So Hullbreacher is a 3 mana creature, Merfolk Pirate with Flash. It costs 2 generic and 1 blue mana, and it says if an opponent would draw a card except the first one they draw on each of their draw steps, instead you create a treasure token. Again, I don't really have to explain why this was banned. It's a super broken ability. Having this be a non-symmetrical effect where it only affects your opponents and turns all their extra card draw into treasures for you is extremely broken. The treasures don't even come into play tapped, they come into play untapped, you can use them immediately. So it makes perfect sense why this card was banned. However, punishing excessive draw in Commander is super important. In modern day Commander, there are too many decks that just revolve around value for themselves. They play a bunch of lands, they draw a bunch of cards, they don't really do anything, but they end up winning games because they have all the cards and mana. Wizards has started printing more card draw punishers, but we need even more of them. There needs to be a calculated risk with drawing tons and tons of cards. So while I don't think the answer is necessarily Hullbreacher, I do think this card could be redesigned. So let's keep the 3 mana, let's keep the flash ability, and let's keep the opponent clause. But let's change the draw punishing clause to something more Commander unique. If an opponent would draw a card except for the first one they draw on each of their draw steps, instead each player draws a card. Now the player who's trying to draw extra cards runs into the risk of giving everyone at the table cards. This will do a couple things. One, it will make the player trying to draw extra cards really think about that decision. Is drawing those 3 extra cards worth giving the table 9 cards? It will change the timing of how they do it. They'll have to wait till everyone's tapped down so they can draw cards and not have to worry about responses to them drawing cards. It will also most importantly make games of Commander more fun because now everyone's getting in on the action, not just one player. And instead of punishing everyone at the table with Hullbreacher's ability and only rewarding one player, now the card punishes the card draw player while rewarding everyone else. So by inverting that tree, Hullbreacher becomes much less of a ban-worthy card and much more of a game-changing pivotal play. This is just an example. There's lots of ways to punish players who draw way too many cards, but as far as an effect inside the blue color pie, I feel like this is a good example of what Wizards' design should be focusing on moving on into the future. So the next card I want to talk about is Korvold, Fey Cursed King. This card's going to represent a style of Commander that Wizards seems to keep printing. And that is commanders that have really cool abilities but are way overpowered. So Korvold, for example, is a really cool commander. He costs 2 generic, black, red, green, He's a dragon noble with flying, and says whenever Korvold Fey Cursed King enters the battlefield or attacks, sacrifice another permanent. Whenever you sacrifice a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold and draw a card. So I'm just not convinced that Wizards playtested this card appropriately. I understand what they might have thought when they made this card, which was basically whenever Korvold enters or attacks, he'll get a +1/+1 counter. But that's not really how the card is worded. It says whenever you sacrifice a permanent, not whenever he enters the battlefield or attacks. So with things like treasures and clues and other trinket artifacts, not to mention creature sacrifice strategies, it's incredibly easy to make this dragon gigantic right away. And that's just a bummer because the ability is super cool. But even if we took out the +1/+1 counter clause, being able to draw a card whenever you sacrifice a permanent is also broken. Just imagine, Korvold comes down, you have 5 treasures, you sacrifice one of them, draw a card. You then pop all the other treasures to make whatever mana you need, you draw 4 cards. The same turn Korvold came down, he's already a 9/9 and drew you 5 cards. That's way too powerful. But the ability is super cool. As someone who loves self-sacrifice strategies and loves Jund colors, I really want to build this deck, but it's just too powerful. Even if you try to build it in a powered down way, it's still too powerful. So the way I would try to fix this card is by keeping the sacrifice clause, because that's the coolest part of the card. There aren't a ton of self-sacrifice commanders out there that revolve around sacrificing any kind of permanent. There are a handful, but this is by far the coolest ability. Drawing a card every time you sacrifice a permanent is a very fun effect, but we have to put limits on it because it's just too easy to do. So let's keep Korvold a flyer, and let's keep the clause about whenever he enters the battlefield and attacks, you have to sacrifice a permanent. However, we get rid of the +1/+1 counter clause, and then let's put a cap on the card draw. Something like, whenever you sacrifice a permanent, draw a card, this ability only activates once per turn. So this limits you to only drawing 1 card per turn, but you can still sacrifice permanents on your opponent's turn. So you can still draw 4 cards per turn cycle, which again is still very powerful, but it doesn't also give you a gigantic flying commander damage causing creature as well. And it prevents situations where players will play Korvold and have 10 permanents ready to sacrifice and be able to draw 10 cards at a moment's notice. So while Korvold would still be strong, he'd be much more balanced. And instead of being the engine and the win con all rolled up into one, he would just be the engine. Wizards, stop doing this. You make these commanders with really cool effects, but then they end up being totally broken. The next card I want to touch on is Farewell. I think we've all been on the receiving end of this card, and it doesn't feel that great. So 6 mana, 4 generic, white, sorcery, choose 1 or more, exile all artifacts, exile all creatures, exile all enchantments, exile all graveyards. So on paper, this card seems fine. It obviously is a pushed card design. Having a modal spell where you can choose all 4 options is already a little suspicious. Usually they limit you to 2 or less. But hey, we're in modern day Magic, so it is what it is. I think being able to choose all modes would be fine if this card said destroy instead of exile for each mode. But if we're going to keep this card as an exile effect, we have to limit it. While you do have cards like Austere Command and other white wraths that let you choose multiple modes, all of them say destroy. And the big difference between destroy and exile is that destroyed permanents go to the graveyard and therefore can be recurred or interacted with. Exile is a blanket effect that gets around most forms of interaction in Commander. Really, the only thing I can think of that gets around it is phasing out, which is an effect that pretty much only exists in white. So if we're going to keep this card as an exile effect, we need to make it so that you can only choose one of these modes. And I don't even care if we knock off a mana off this card and make it 5 mana. Exile Wraths are one of those types of cards that really have no way of being counteracted. And once the permanents are exiled, they're gone forever. There's no real practical way to get them back from exile. Like I said, as a destroy effect, totally fine. There are ways to recur artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. You obviously would have to remove the exile all graveyard modes because that would negate the destroy abilities, but there are plenty of effects that destroy all non-land permanents, so this version of the card would fit right in line with those. What makes this card so unfun to play against is everything gets exiled and then it's gone forever. And like I said, there's no way to interact with it except for on the stack. Effects like Swords to Plowshares exile a creature, but you could give the creature hexproof, or shroud, or you could flicker it. So there are ways to interact with that spell. However, with a board wipe, none of those answers would work. Wizards needs to be really careful when designing exile board wipes in the future. I'm not saying they're bad, but they need to be much more narrow than Farewell. So those are some of the cards from across Magic's history that I think could be redesigned for modern day Commander. I'm sure there's more of them out there, but these are some of the main ones that I think about a lot. If there's a card that I missed that you'd like me to talk about, leave a comment down below. Make sure to also like and subscribe, and if you want, join the channel Discord. That's where other members from the channel talk about Magic and request decks for me to try on the channel. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Later.